Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming. We're pleased to welcome you to the annual Sojourner Truth Lecture. The Sojourner Truth Lecture was conceived as a way to recognize the intersections of race, class, and gender. The lecture is a collaboration between African and African American Studies and Women and Gender Studies. Each year, the lecture is scheduled at the intersection of Black History Month and Women's History Month. This year, as you all, I'm sorry, let me keep going. Sorry, I printed out the wrong version. Last year, African and African American Studies adopted policing black bodies as their guiding theme for events, and we joined them in that collaboration, as well as many other departments and programs. To continue the dialogue and expand upon last year's theme, we have selected soul killings as our theme for 2015-2016 academic year. African and African American Studies and Women and Gender Studies and other units expressed a strong desire to continue and expand the conversation that we started in 2014. This year, we have intentionally planned events to help us think critically about the world around us, about what's happening in the news, for example, policing in Black and brown communities, violence against Black and brown transgender brother and sisters, the militarization of poor communities, and environmental racism like we're seeing in places like Flint, Michigan. So a central question for us when we think about soul killing is, what does it mean for our souls to be literally, spiritually, and psychologically and economically killed? What does this mean for Mason students, staff, faculty, Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Arab Americans, Asian Americans, Indigenous Americans, naturalized Americans, men, women, children, gender, queer, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, atheists, the list is long, agnostics, people in the LGBTQI communities, lower and middle class, working class, unemployed, Fairfax community members, U.S. citizens or undocumented immigrants, to not feel safe, to not be safe, to have their souls wounded or killed. Our lecture today will deepen that understanding. And if you weren't excited enough about the theme, we have t-shirts. Right? Awesome t-shirt. This can be yours if you stay for the end of the lecture, and they'll be available at the reception. We always keep them for the very end. Couple of announcements. You're sitting on top of or have already picked up an assessment tool. Please take the time to fill that out at the end of the event. It helps us track what kinds of things go on in our programs, what's successful and not successful, and we'll also be passing that feedback along as well to you as you think about future appointments. We're going to be photographing the event and also videotaping. If you don't want to be photographed or videotaped, maybe Karen, can you raise your hand? Let Karen know if you don't want to be on the videotape, and we'll be sure to not include you in the videotaping. The videotaping is so we can keep an archive. We've done it for the last 3 years so that people can go back and revisit these lectures after the speakers have already left campus. Finally, please put your cell phones away. Out of respect for your neighbors and for the speakers and for everybody around us. Unless they're, right, we are, thank you. This is a new addition. We are live tweeting, we are tweeting the event. You can see up here as well in the back corner, actually it's been moved to the window. Please tweet at the Women and Gender Studies program. Hashtag is Sojourner Truth 2016. We're going to be collecting these tweets, so please do keep your phone out for tweeting. If you are not tweeting, however, please put your phone away. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Wendy Manuel Scott, who's on the phone tweeting.
Hello, good afternoon. We are packed. We are in the house. Yes?
Yes.
Woo! All right, so for our Sojourner Truth Lecture, I'm so pleased to introduce to you Professor Nekima Levy-Pound. She is an award-winning professor of law, civil rights attorney, and a nationally recognized expert on a range of civil rights and social justice issues at the intersections of race, public policy, economic justice, public education, juvenile justice, and criminal justice system. A great deal of her legal work, scholarly writing, and advocacy focuses on identifying and implementing solutions for improving the quality of life for African Americans in general, and in particular, young African American men. One example of her commitment is Brotherhood, Inc. She is the co-founder and board chair of Brotherhood, Inc., a nonprofit organization geared toward young African American men ages 16 to 24 who have been involved in the criminal justice system or gangs or who are at risk for such involvement. Professor Levy Pound serves as the president of Minneapolis NAACP chapter and chair of the Minnesota State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Professor Levy Pounds is also active in the local Black Lives Matter movement, working with young people to raise awareness of systemic issues that impact African Americans. And as a professor, blogger, and racial justice activist, she is also the author of numerous scholarly articles and essays on structural, systemic issues that impact poor communities of color. Dr. Levy Pound's passion for communities of color is deep. I witnessed this afternoon her intense conversation with some students at Mason, and her commitment to racial justice is clear and real, and her belief in the power of everyday people to create change is undeniable. So it is with great pleasure that we welcome Nekima Levy Pounds to George Mason University as our 2016 Sojourner Truth Lecturer.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
All right, I'm just going to unwind my microphone in case I walk around. All right, is that better?
Yeah.
All right, it's a privilege and an honor to be here with you all today at George Mason. This is my first time in Fairfax, Virginia. Although I previously lived in Maryland, I worked in Washington, D.C. right after law school. It's always wonderful to come back to this area. It's steeped in history and culture, and it's really a beautiful place. I'm sure that you all find this to be a beautiful place to go to school. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and experience and the activism that I've been engaged in. My hope today is that you will be inspired and challenged, and that there will be something here for everyone based upon the words that I speak. I'm going to speak for probably about 45 minutes or so, and then allow some time for questions and answers. And then afterwards, there's going to be a reception. So hopefully I'll have a chance to engage some of you at that time. So our theme today has to do with killing souls. I would say that a lot of the work that I've been blessed to be engaged in has been related to preventing the killing of souls. One way that I think about this has to do with trying to protect people who are vulnerable and on the margins of society. We live in a society that so often focuses on crushing the weak and keeping people on the bottom. And it really takes those of us who have had access to education and opportunity to stand against that in the spirit of Dr. King, in the spirit of Rosa Parks, in the spirit of Sojourner Truth, after whom this lecture is named, in order for us to protect those who typically don't have a voice in our society. So that's what I've set out to do. It took me a while to be able to find my voice, and now that I have it, I refuse to be refused. I refuse to close my mouth. I refuse to watch injustice happen in front of me and to do nothing about it. And I try to instill in my students a duty and an obligation to fight on behalf of those who are on the margins of society. And I would urge each of you to think about the fact that you've been given this gift called education, access to higher education, access to upward mobility and a higher quality of life, and what are you going to do with it? Are you going to focus on the enrichment of yourself and your own souls? Or are you going to protect other souls from being killed, marginalized, and oppressed? So that's the groundwork that I want to lay. In terms of my background, I was born in Jackson, Mississippi in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement in 1976. I grew up in a poor African American community. My grandmother was a cafeteria lady. My granddad worked construction. Most of the people in my family were employed. However, we were still extremely poor. Sometimes we relied upon my grandmother bringing home extra food from work, in addition to the work that she did at the local elementary school. She also cleaned homes for white families in the area. That was not unusual in a place like Mississippi, a place in which, although the civil rights movement was very active in that particular part of the country, folks were still very poor in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination. And so as a child growing up, I didn't understand civil rights history. I didn't understand the struggle that had happened, but I looked around my community and I actually felt a sense of love. And part of that had to do with the fact that in Black communities in the South in particular, even if people are poor, they're able to create a nourishing environment. So we had lots of green space to run around in when we were kids. If we got into trouble in our community, you wouldn't just be scolded by your parents. Your neighbors would act as your parents. And you would get in trouble by them, and then they would call your parents and you get in trouble again. So there was a strong sense of accountability, and we learned things. We learned to use our hands, and we learned to use our gifts and talents in that environment. And so I felt very loved. But when I was 8.5 years old, my mother moved my sisters and I from Jackson, Mississippi to South Central Los Angeles. I will never forget getting off the Greyhound bus, walking through the community, seeing graffiti on the walls, and seeing what looked like a land of desolation. It was like night and day between what I had experienced in Mississippi and what I saw in South Central LA. Part of it had to do with the fact that I lived in a mostly poor Black and Latino community. Most of the folks had been marginalized. There was a high rate of unemployment in that environment, and it was at the start of the war on drugs. For those who are unaware of the war on drugs, it has been single-handedly responsible for the explosive prison growth that we have experienced in the United States. We have 5% of the world's population, and yet we have 25% of the world's prisoners. The war on drugs began in the mid-1980s because of Congress's focus of getting tough on crime. There was a perception that there was an exploding drug problem in the United States. A lot of that had to do with round-the-clock media coverage of the influx of crack cocaine, particularly in inner city communities. So there was a lot of negative media coverage about African Americans in particular being involved in drug-related crime. As a result of all of the news coverage, there was a hyper sense of fear around the country and even within inner city communities. I remember watching those news stories as a kid and at times being fearful of walking down the street in my own neighborhood, which now that I look back, it's really shameful to think that as a kid I allowed the media's perception of my neighbors and my community to influence how I saw the people around me. Because I understand the power of media. I challenge media a lot in my work, and I realize that sometimes media reports can be biased. They can sensationalize information and they can reinforce negative stereotypes. So I push back against a lot of that. But as a kid growing up, I didn't know any better. I remember walking around my community and looking at my neighbors, wondering if people, were on crack cocaine or, what was gonna happen. And I wasn't alone. A lot of people felt that way. And so during the early 1980s, one of the things that Congress did was to hastily enact draconian drug laws. They put in place mandatory minimum sentences and the sentencing guidelines. And their focus was to go after drug kingpins and high-level dealers. That's what they said that they were going to do. But in the aftermath of the implementation of the war on drugs, the exact opposite happened. Most of the people who began filling our nation's prisons were actually low-level dealers, street dealers, the lowest hanging fruit in a long string of folks involved in drug trafficking. And most of the people in the upper echelon of drug trafficking rings don't look like the people who are filling our prisons, who are mostly poor and Black and poor and Latino. Congress didn't conduct any studies. They quickly enacted these laws and these policies, and they formed the war on drugs. Now think about the fact that when the United States of America decides to go to war, it really goes to war. That they purchase equipment, they hire personnel, they train people, they have ammunitions, weapons, surveillance equipment, the list goes on and on. Typically, they're using this technology and equipment outside of the country, but when they waged the war on drugs, they did it domestically. And they did it primarily against poor people of color, people who could not fight back, people who did not have a political voice in society, and typically people who did not have adequate access to legal representation. And this went on and has gone on for years. And I'll just give you an example of how it's led to an increase in our prison population. In 1980, before the war on drugs began, there were 500,000 people incarcerated in this country. By 1990, just about 5 or 6 years after the war on drugs began, that number doubled to 1 million. By 2000, that number doubled to 2 million. And now there are more than 2.3 million people currently incarcerated. 40% are African American men. There's also been a fast-growing number of African American and Latinas who have been brought into the criminal justice system. Oftentimes, these women lived at or below the poverty line prior to their incarceration, and they were the last line of defense for their children, because many of these women are mothers to children who are under age 18. When mothers are incarcerated, their children typically wind up living with relatives who have very limited resources, or they go into the foster care system, where at times they risk being further abused and neglected. Black children who are over age 10 are the least likely to actually be adopted out of foster care. Part of the reason why we've seen a drastic increase in the number of women of color who've been brought into the system was because of how the war on drugs was constructed. When it was put in place, I mentioned earlier that Congress claimed that they were going to go after high-level drug dealers and kingpins. But instead, the way that they structured the law, they focused very heavily on removing judicial discretion, putting in place mandatory minimum sentences and the sentencing guidelines that mostly looked at the quantity of drugs that someone was connected to. So let's say that a person was a local street dealer, let's call him Lil Ray Ray, okay? And when I lived in South Central LA, there were some guys I would say were like Lil Ray Ray who were standing on the corner. The difference though is that Lil Ray Ray was a friend of mine. I felt like Lil Ray Ray was one of my brothers. I never demonized Lil Ray Ray or saw him in a negative light per se, because I understood that when you're in an environment where people are marginalized, you don't have a political voice, where unemployment is high, you feel that you have very limited choices. And that's what happened to a lot of young men in my community. To make matters worse, we had an overconcentration of police in my community. So rather than the powers that be investing in resources to create more jobs for impoverished areas, they often created a heavier police presence. And that led to people like the Lil Ray Rays of my community cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. So that's what I witnessed. Now, when Congress put the war on drugs in place, one of the things that they did was they said, okay, we're not just gonna focus on the drug kingpins and the high-level dealers. We're gonna focus on anyone who is connected to that particular drug ring. So someone like Lil Ray Ray, who may be, again, at the bottom of the scale as far as being a drug dealer is concerned, has the most to lose and the least to gain, is suddenly being seen as a drug kingpin under the law. So perhaps Lil Ray Ray has a small quantity of drugs. That is enough, if Lil Ray Ray is connected to a larger drug ring, for him to be charged as part of a drug conspiracy. So rather than maybe spending a year in a local county jail, Lil Ray Ray is looking at 10, 15, or 20 years in prison for being a low-level street dealer. The reality is that the vast majority of people who have been incarcerated for drug-related crimes are people in the lower echelon of a drug trafficking ring. Women who dated people like Lil Ray Ray or were married to them, perhaps they didn't deal drugs themselves, but they allowed drugs to be stashed in their homes. Maybe they answered the phone, maybe they were in possession of drugs. They could also be charged as part of a drug conspiracy and sentenced to 10, 15, 20 years in prison, and sometimes life. There are a lot of women right now who are in federal prison and in state prisons for being connected to street level dealers. One woman that I encountered since I started this journey of focusing on mass incarceration and the war on drugs and trying to make sense of my childhood in South Central Los Angeles, her name was Kimba Smith. Has anyone heard of Kimba Smith? Okay, so Kimba Smith is from Richmond, Virginia. And she got caught up in the war on drugs. She was African American from a middle class family. And she left home and went to Hampton University. While at Hampton, she became connected to a drug dealer. In fact, she dated him, and he was abusive towards Kimba. He had sent her to the hospital more than once as a result of his abuse. Now, FBI agents started honing in on the man that Kimba was dating. They approached her and asked her to cooperate in their prosecution of him. Because she loved him and because she was afraid of him, Kimba said no. Her family, like I said, it was middle class, convinced Kimba to cooperate with government authorities. By the time that she agreed to cooperate, her boyfriend was killed. Rather than the FBI and prosecutors dropping the case, they actually went after Kimba. They charged her as part of a drug conspiracy. Kimba pleaded not guilty. She was tried by an all-white jury. She was found guilty, even though she never sold drugs herself. And she was sentenced to 24 and a half years in prison. Because Kimba's family was middle class, they were able to tap into their network and their resources and to bring national attention to Kimba's plight, making her the face of the war on drugs. After all of their lobbying and advocacy and bringing attention to this matter, this all began in 1994. Kimba was granted executive clemency by President Clinton in 2000. So after serving 6.5 years in prison, she was miraculously released. I've met Kimba on at least 2 occasions and sat down and talked to her about her experience. One aspect of her experience that is unique and that is soul crushing is the fact that when Kimba was incarcerated, she was already pregnant. And she had to give birth to her son during that period of time. The only reason that her son did not go into the foster care system, which, as I said before, is typically what happens, is because a nurse at the hospital in which Kimba gave birth put her mom and dad in a room down the hall, and as soon as the baby was born, that nurse took the baby, handed it off to the parents, and the parents left the hospital. That's the only way that baby escaped being in the system. Kimba only got to hold her baby for a few minutes. And because she was in the federal prison system, she was away from her family, shipped to different locations, which is what happens in the federal prison system. The Supreme Court has even upheld people can live thousands of miles away, even as far as Hawaii, and that is okay under the law. What we have to understand about this system is that it is not just about getting tough on crime. As the media would like for us to think, as politicians would like for us to think, we have to understand that there is a profit motive that is very heavily involved in our system of mass incarceration. We have prison stocks that are traded on Wall Street. We have large companies that invest in prison labor. I've gone to many prisons and jails in the state of Minnesota, and I've seen prisoners packaging those big anagram balloons, the aluminum balloons that you would typically have for someone's birthday. I've seen prisoners packaging those. I've seen them packaging Sesame Street toys for Target. Some prisoners do construction work and on, and they get paid 50 cents, 75 cents, $1 an hour to do labor that if they were on the outside, they wouldn't have access to because they have a criminal history. And so these companies are able to have prisoners do their work behind closed doors. What we have to understand is that this is known as the prison industrial complex. And a lot of us haven't looked into what that means. But in reality, we see companies profiting off of the backs of prisoners, exploiting the labor of prisoners, exploiting those on the margins, because the majority of prisoners lived at or below the poverty line prior to their incarceration. Beyond that, over 50% of prisoners have an underlying mental health issue. It's even higher for women. In some prisons, over 70% of women are on psychotropic meds. And many women experience domestic abuse or sexual abuse prior to age 18. And they're the overwhelming majority of the women who are incarcerated. And so I see it as a soul-crushing phenomenon because we're taking society's undesirables and we're locking them out of our sight as a society, which I think is inhumane and deeply problematic. But what we have to understand is that this is not a new phenomenon. Think about the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. Okay, so I went to law school, we studied the Constitution. We studied the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We glossed over the language of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It wasn't until later when I became a legal scholar and I started studying the war on drugs and mass incarceration, I said, well, wait a minute, how did all this begin? And then I remembered vaguely the language of the 13th Amendment. And then when I went back and looked, I was shocked. Now, the 13th Amendment was enacted in 1865, just 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which supposedly freed the slaves. But when you look at the language of the 13th Amendment, and I will paraphrase, it says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be allowed except if one has been duly convicted of a crime. Now think about this. The fact that we had the exploitation of black labor since the 1600s, the fact that people were treated inhumanely and brutally under that system, black women's bodies were exploited, black women were raped, they were beaten, they were forced to bear children by different men, and their children could be snatched away as soon as they were born and placed in the institution of slavery. There was no place of safety unless you escaped to go up north. And we have to remember, when we think about up north, there was slavery up north. There was slavery in places like New York. We know that Jamestown, Virginia was the birthplace of slavery in America. But so often, northern racism escapes scrutiny in the grand scheme of things. And I would argue that some of the worst racism happens in northern states. And I'm saying that as someone who lives in the state of Minnesota, which I've now taken to calling the Jim Crow North. It's escaped a lot of scrutiny, but there is a great deal of racism. The KKK was birthed in the 1920s in the state of Minnesota. And people may not be walking around with hoods and robes on, but they're still carrying forward a lot of the detrimental policies that helped to kill the black soul. And I would argue that that's the case in many northern states. So black people were not free from inhumane treatment and brutality and having their families separated, having their humanity be denied, being forced to work for free. Did you know that slaves built Washington, D.C.? Yes. And as a matter of fact, a French man, I believe, had actually drafted the plans for Washington, D.C. He got so mad about the levels of racism that existed that he took the plans and he left. His assistant had been born into slavery, Benjamin Banneker. He had a photographic memory. And after the architect left, Benjamin Banneker rewrote all the plans. This was a black man. And then they used slaves to build Washington, D.C. Those are parts of our heritage and history that many of us are unaware of. When we walk around, when we see incidents happening in 2015, 2016, where people are complaining about racism and discrimination, and we act as though those things are happening in a vacuum, as opposed to understanding that this is a part of the long thread of America's racist history, of people being humiliated, of their humanity being denied. And so with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, imagine Congress having the power to end slavery in this country once and for all. Because they could have simply said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be allowed, period, point blank, end of story. But instead, they opened the door to a new form of slavery through the criminal justice system. And you want to know what happened? In many southern states, they changed the laws on the books to make standard behavior by black men a crime. Prior to the end of slavery, the prisons were filled with mostly poor white men. See, that's been a strategy amongst wealthy, landholding white men from the very beginning, to keep the interests of enslaved blacks separate and apart from indentured and poor whites. That's how race became inserted into the fabric of America, to try to keep poor white indentured servants from black slaves, because they were working hand in hand in the field. They were getting along with each other. And they were upset with the elite white male landowners who were oppressing them and hoarding all of the resources. And because those landowners were afraid that those groups would band together and kill them or overthrow them, they started to tell poor whites, no, you are not as well off as we are, but at least you're not the N-word. And that's what they began to ingrain in the psyche of poor white people. And that has led to a deep racial divide that persists until this day, to the point where you have poor whites willing to fight against their own interests to keep people of color oppressed. And of course, this is not all poor white people, but there are enough people who feel that way that the racial divide continues from one generation to the next. And we've had some of the most egregious violence happen in this country at the hands of white men who have joined white supremacist groups and KKK and the KKK to perpetuate violence upon African Americans. So again, the things we see now are a perpetuation of what happened during history. But Congress had the chance to change it when they wrote the 13th Amendment, and they didn't. So when those southern states changed their laws on the books, they made it a crime for black men to hang out late at night, spit on the sidewalk, a crime, being unemployed, a crime, talking too loud, a crime. Southern white sheriffs would come into black communities. They would take those African American men, they would bring them into the criminal justice system. They would be tried by an all-white jury, found guilty 9 times out of 10, and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. For many of those black men, the terms that they were sentenced to was a death sentence, because they had to perform back-breaking labor in sweltering heat, unsanitary conditions, and many of them died during their period of incarceration. There are stories of black men working in mines who were prisoners and being blown to smithereens because of the dangerous conditions that they endured. But these are things that we don't talk about when we talk about our history and when we talk about the ugly roots of the criminal justice system. There are pictures of black boys standing in a field in Florida wearing striped uniforms in the aftermath of slavery and before the formal juvenile justice system was put in place. And it looks like these boys are standing on a slave plantation, but instead they're in the criminal justice system in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So when you look at the system of mass incarceration today, and we realize that 40% of those who are incarcerated are African American men, we have to understand that that is connected to what has happened historically. Society would have us believe that there's something in the DNA of black people that causes us to supposedly commit more crimes, when the reality is that there are conditions that have been created, specifically within our inner city communities, that may make it more likely for people to commit survival crimes because they have inadequate access to resources. And if you look at drug-related crime, a lot of that is survival-based crime, where people become engaged in those underground industries in order to be able to put food on their table, like Lil Ray Ray, and like a lot of the young men who were in my community in South Central Los Angeles. One of the things that we have to do in order to avoid killing souls is to begin to pay attention. We have to begin to ask key questions. We have to engage in critical thinking. We have to listen to the narratives that are put forward and then question them, challenge them, and deconstruct them. And at other times put forward new narratives that tell the real story, or at a minimum, another side of the story. Those are the things that we each have the power to do. And we don't have to rely upon mainstream media in order to do it. We have access to social media. You all are the generation that is responsible for the proliferation of social media. So think about that as a way of being able to tell a different story about what's really happening in this country. Because most of us are seeing it or experiencing it on a regular basis, but we are not able or willing to use our voices to speak the truth. Now, I was challenged in this just about a year and a half ago. I had been writing about the war on drugs and mass incarceration as a law professor. And as a matter of fact, in August of 2014, after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri at the hands of Darren Wilson, I remember watching the events unfold on social media and on television. I saw the protests and the demonstrations, but I didn't think that I had a role to play in what was happening. I saw young people standing on the front lines day after day, night after night, protesting, demonstrating, chanting, and standing up for what they believed in. And I thought about myself as a lawyer and a scholar. And I didn't think that I had anything to contribute to the movement. I remember watching this unfold and then deciding to write an article about it. And I wrote an article that said, our silence on the war on drugs and mass incarceration led to what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri. And part of that had to do with the fact that as the United States waged war, like I said, domestically, primarily on poor people of color, we were silent. As they put forward harsh laws that caused our prisons to be filled, we were silent. As our police forces became more and more militarized, we were silent. We allowed it to happen. And our silence opened the door to Mike Brown being killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Part of that has to do with our belief in the way that the system functions. So often, many of us think that the laws are fair, that the policies are fair, that people have good intentions, and that we just have to let the system play out. That's what has been ingrained in us for so long. But if you look back at the institution of slavery, you can see that there clearly were laws on the books that were designed to oppress people, that were designed to denigrate them, that were designed to keep them on the margins of society, and that were designed to keep them in an inferior status in this country. So why would we blindly believe in a system like that? And we know that after slavery supposedly ended in this country, that we had a Jim Crow system in place that lasted for over 90 years, where there were signs on bathroom doors that said whites are colored, signs on water fountains, whites are colored, places where black people couldn't even go and have a burger sitting at the counter, hotels where black people couldn't even sleep because of the color of their skin. But thankfully, on December 1st of 1955, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to allow the souls of my people to continue to be killed under this Jim Crow system. So what did she do? She sat on a bus that day, and she was actually in the front of the section that blacks were allowed to sit in on the bus, when a white man approached her and asked her to give up her seat. There are a lot of stories out there that talk about Rosa Parks being tired, her feet were tired and all this. And Rosa Parks said, listen, I wasn't any more tired than I was on any other day getting on that bus. I was tired of injustice, and see, I have to keep it real. I was tired of racial injustice and oppression. And she also talked about the fact that on that day when she refused to give up her seat, that all she could think about was Emmett Till. Emmett Till had been a 14-year-old black boy who was born in Chicago, but his family was from Mississippi. In August of 1955, Emmett Till's mother allowed him to go and visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. Now, because Emmett Till had grown up in Chicago, he was used to mingling with white folks. He had white kids in his class. That wasn't a big deal for him. But he went into a local store, and in order to prove to his friends that he wasn't afraid of white people, he wound up whistling at a white woman, and some say that he said, bye, baby. Well, that woman told her husband, and her husband and his brother went to Emmett Till's uncle's house. In the middle of the night, a few days after the incident, they pulled Emmett Till out of the bed. They took him off into a secluded area, and they beat him, and they beat him, and they beat him, and they tortured him, and they shot him, and they threw his body in the Tallahatchie River. When they pulled his body out, he was unrecognizable. His eyes had come out of the socket. His face was swelled up beyond recognition. The only way that they could identify who he was is because he was wearing a ring. He had initially been wearing a watch before he got on the train to go to Mississippi, but he told his mom, "Mom, you keep this watch. I won't need this where I'm going." But he kept the ring on, and it had been his father's ring. So when they pulled his body out of the Tallahatchie River, his mom identified him only through the ring that he was wearing. And again, this was a child who was murdered. Now, his mother, Mamie Till, was a strong woman because she demanded an open casket funeral. She said that my son's face represents the face of racial hatred in America. So he was a symbol of what had been hidden in American society. And Rosa Parks, on that day, December 1st, 1955, thought about Emmett Till. She thought about the fact that a boy was a sacrificial lamb because of our unreconciled racial history in America, and that his life was taken as a result. So she refused to give up her seat. And the reality is that we celebrate Rosa Parks for her act of heroism, but we don't realize she had a mugshot for what she did. Rosa Parks was arrested. So the criminal justice system was used against her for engaging in civil disobedience. Even for Dr. King, every year, we whitewash Dr. King's image, we sanitize his message, we talk about how peaceful and nonviolent he is, but if we read his real speeches, we will see that there is not a big difference between what Dr. King said and what Malcolm X said. And as a matter of fact, on the day that Dr. King was assassinated, he had a speech in his pocket called "Why America May Go to Hell." See, that's the Dr. King we don't hear about when we're celebrating aspects of his life that appeal to us and that appease us. And we also don't remember the fact that Dr. King at one point was the most hated man in America. And this was a man that preached nonviolent resistance to oppression. We got to understand that history in order to go forward. So as I'm watching the events in Ferguson, it made me think about what I had studied about the civil rights movement in this country. About how people in the aftermath of Rosa Parks' act of heroism decided that enough was enough. They decided we're not going to continue riding this city bus and being complicit in Jim Crow segregation and discrimination, that we're going to fight back through the power of the purse and the pocketbook, and we're not going to ride this bus. We're not going to spend our money. And for over a year, they walked, they carpooled, they took cabs, they did whatever they had to do to not ride that bus. And guess what? The walls of Jim Crow came tumbling down as a result. So we have to understand that when we're talking about this movement and fighting against soul killing, that one person can make a difference, even though society tries to tell us that the opposite is true. See, when I looked at what was happening in Ferguson, I realized that young people realized that they could make a difference. That they didn't have to sit back and watch people be killed by police or vigilantes or security guards, black people killed every 28 hours, and act like it was par for the course. Like most of us are conditioned to believe. They said, no, we're going to fight back, we're going to do something different. And even with me watching that and being inspired by that, I still didn't think I had a role to play. So I'm just writing articles like a law professor. And then one day my life changed. The day that the grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson. I remember watching the events unfold once again. I saw situations that really stirred me. I saw police throwing tear gas canisters into safe houses. I saw pictures of people running. I saw pictures of children crying because they had been tear gassed. They had tears mixed with milk of magnesia streaming down their faces to try to cool them off from the burning. I saw the governor and the other powers that be intentionally announced that the grand jury was not going to indict Darren Wilson under the cover of darkness, knowing that rioting had already happened, knowing that, buildings had burned, they didn't care. And I felt that they had done it intentionally so that whatever their response would be under the cover of darkness. I knew that they had more weapons, they had surveillance equipment, they were a militarized police force. And something about that really bothered me as someone who has studied these issues. So that night I began to say, I think I need to go to Ferguson. And I remember talking to my family about going to Ferguson and asking my children to pray for me about the decision to go to Ferguson the next day. And my son, who was 9 or 10 at the time, he looked at me and he said, Mom, God said this is part of your journey. And that had a real impact on me. So the next day I bought a ticket and jumped on a plane to Ferguson. I didn't know where I was going to stay. All I had was the address and a phone number to the local office of the National Lawyers Guild. So I headed there to serve as a volunteer, a legal observer. And I remember being trained, and we were told, it's possible that you might get tear gas. I really didn't believe it. I'm thinking that's not going to happen. Well, my first night there, it did happen. When we got to Ferguson, we went, initially, one of the first things that struck me was the fact that as soon as we walked on the street where a lot of the action was happening, we had young African American teens approaching us, and they were afraid. And we said, why are you guys going in the opposite direction of where everyone else is? And they said, because there are snipers on the rooftop. And I'm like, snipers? Like, we didn't hear about this in the media. What do you mean snipers? There's snipers up there. And when we looked on the rooftops of the various buildings, there were white men standing there with rifles. They were not police. They were not the National Guard. Later, we found out that they were volunteers, many of whom, for gas money, came to protect the property in Ferguson. And so when those young people got out of their car, one of the snipers pointed a rifle at them and said, "What the F are you doing? Get back in the car." And so they were afraid to stay in the car, so they got out, but they walked in the opposite direction. And because of what they experienced, they were afraid to go down to where the action was happening because they didn't know if they were going to get shot by the snipers. And we said, well, we're legal observers. And most of us were lawyers or law students from other parts of the country who dropped everything to travel to Ferguson. And so we said, well, we have to go down there. That's why we're here. You guys can walk with us, but we have to go. And they refused to do it because they were afraid. So we walked down the street and looking at the snipers, just shaking my head like, I can't believe this. And we got down to the police station, which is where the main action was happening. So there's a police station here, a fire station right next to it. And there's a line of police in riot gear. And behind them are the National Guard. Now, on the opposite side of them are protesters from different racial backgrounds, different age groups, but the vast majority of the protesters were young people. And they were chanting, they were protesting, they were calling out the police. The majority of them were nonviolent. Every now and then a protester would throw something at the police. And what I saw was an amazing system of accountability, where people would point out the protester that threw something and threaten that person, like, you're not gonna get the rest of us killed. Or say, here he is, he did it, he threw the bottle or threw whatever. And so at one point, a group of demonstrators broke away from the crowd, went around the corner, found an empty police car, flipped it over, and set it on fire. And so all the other protesters went in that direction because you had the police, the fire department, all going into that area to put out the fire. And after they put the fire out, I was standing in the vicinity of a bunch of protesters. I had my lime green hat on, which is what we wore as legal observers so that the police could identify us. Well, that didn't matter because someone took a bottle and they threw it at the back of a police SUV. And no one was hit, thankfully, but it did bust the tail light of the SUV. The next thing I know, this huge police officer gets out of the back of the SUV, puts on this giant mask that looked like a huge gas mask, and just started spraying us like roaches without warning. Now, I thought I was an activist before Ferguson, However, I realized I was really just an armchair activist, like stuck in my little ivory tower. Because when you are tear gassed, you cannot breathe, you cannot see, and you have fluid just running down your face, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And it lasts for like 15 minutes. There's no tissues out there. Yeah, I had to get leaves to try to dry my face off so that I could see. Couldn't breathe, and I'm just thinking, I'm not about this life. Like, that's when it hit me like, this is Thanksgiving week. I should be like cooking dressing and macaroni and cheese at home. And instead I'm out here like, oh my goodness. So it freaked me out. But one of the things that was a saving grace for me was as I recovered 15 minutes later from being tear gassed, I looked around and I saw young people who had also been tear gassed. The difference was that those young people, after the tear gas wore off, they got right back on the front lines, chanting, protesting, demonstrating, back to their mission of fighting for what they believed in. That had a profound impact on me. So the next day, when I went back out there, I just had a completely different mentality. At one point, as we're walking down the streets of Ferguson, we were standing, close to one of the buildings where there was a sniper on a rooftop. And some young people came up and they were talking to the snipers. And they were like, asking them questions about why they were there. And they were like, oh, we're volunteers, we're just here for gas money. And they're like, oh, that's dope. And I'm like, wait, what? So I was walking away, and then I came and I was like, that's not dope. I totally got out of my role as a legal observer. I became a mom at that point. I'm like, that's not dope. I'm like, you guys are willing to stand on a rooftop for gas money with rifles, willing to shoot somebody for property that's not even yours. And so we had an exchange, me and the sniper, and he had a gun, but I didn't care. And there was a young woman there who was a filmmaker who just happened to catch the exchange, and she put it on YouTube. And it got tens of thousands of views, we saw later. And it was called Property Over People. And most of the people who I believe watched the video were people who believe in preserving property rights above the rights of people. See, that's the thread that runs through a lot of civil rights history and racial justice history in this country, protecting property rights. Think about all of the black people as Jim Crow segregation was beginning to end, whose families moved into predominantly white neighborhoods and who were chased out by angry white mobs, whose houses were burned down, some of whom were killed by angry white mobs not wanting black families to move into their neighborhoods. Why? Because they were concerned about their property values going down. And lest we think that was times of old, think about today what happens when more than one black family moves into an all-white neighborhood. The next thing you know, we see white flight beginning to happen, where people get out of those communities and they move to a different suburb or even the exurbs or what we have right now. So again, these are threads running through our history that continue to impact us. So during my time in Ferguson, not only did I experience those things that I talked about, I witnessed young people on Black Friday shutting down the Galleria Mall. The only weapons that they had were words and their voices. They took Christmas carols and they changed the words to talk about police brutality and those who had been killed by police. And they went to every single floor of that mall singing those Christmas carols in harmony. And it was very powerful to witness, because through that process of nonviolent peaceful protest, security guards shut down the mall and they lost tens of millions of dollars on Black Friday. When I got back to the Twin Cities a couple days later, I was approached by young people who said that they wanted to start a Black Lives Matter Minneapolis chapter, and they said, will you help us? Now, I had no idea what help I could provide. I'm like, I'm a law professor. However, I said that I was willing to help. And so I went to the first meeting. I remember having a suit on. Everyone else was dressed all casually. I'm like, I feel like a duck out of water, but I'm like, okay. So I sat through it, and they said, our first action is going to be to connect with a fast food workers strike. And after that demonstration, we're gonna keep marching and we're gonna shut down I-35, which is one of the busiest highways in the state of Minnesota. And I remember gulping and thinking, am I ready for this? But I said, okay. And so I was part of the shutdown of I-35, and we experienced, I would say, a surreal experience, because there were people who were obviously very angry at us, but there were also people honking their horns in solidarity with us. And I remember as we're marching down the highway, we're demonstrating, we're chanting, we're protesting, we did die-ins. And during those die-ins, we would lie on the concrete for 4.5 minutes to symbolize the 4.5 hours that Mike Brown's body was just lying on the sidewalk after he was killed. And it was a very powerful experience. We had the state troopers marching alongside us saying, exit at the next exit of the highway or you will be arrested. And the young people said, we're gonna keep going. And we did. Thankfully, the state troopers realized that it would have taken longer to arrest us than to just let us naturally exit the freeway at our true exit point. After we left there, we went down to City Hall and we confronted local politicians about the fact that they were going to take money out of the budget that was supposed to be geared towards equity. I mean, we literally got in their faces and we told them, we will not re-elect you if you don't put this money back in the budget. We can't afford to have this happen in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, which we call a tale of two cities. The best of times if you're white and the worst of times if you're black. We have one of the highest unemployment disparity rates in the country between blacks and whites. We said, how dare you try to take equity out of the budget? And because of the stance that we took and because of the fact that we showed up again a week later at that budget hearing and packed the room, they put that money right back into the budget. So I realized the power of the people standing up for justice and saying that we're not going to sit on the sidelines as these things happen. Now, a few weeks later, our next big action was shutting down the Mall of America, which was the biggest mall in America at the time. Now, technically, we didn't shut it down. That's our legal defense. The mall did. Their security did. Now, right before that Mall of America demonstration, which was on I think December 20th, so right before Christmas, my role had been as a spokesperson in the media for Black Lives Matter. I didn't consider myself an organizer, but prosecutors issued all types of threats, against the young people. I defended them in the media, saying, listen, we are going to get the message out that Black Lives Matter. We're not going to continue to allow people to be killed by police and act as though it's okay. We're gonna use our voices, we're gonna show up. And so that was my role. Well, we had a successful action with over 3,000 people of different racial backgrounds who declared Black Lives Matter. It was a peaceful protest, but we were greeted by police in riot gear. And they clearly shut down the mall after it happened. Well, a few weeks later, they decided to charge 10 people as organizers of that event. Unbeknownst to me, my name wound up on that list. I had never been charged with anything in my life. But because I had been a spokesperson, because I'm a lawyer, because I'm a law professor, they decided to politically retaliate against me, and I was charged with 8 misdemeanors. I was one of 2 people with the most charges, in fact. And again, I wasn't an organizer then, but I became one after they charged me. Okay, you want to charge me as an organizer? Then let's do this. I promise. That's what happened. And so I just told the young people, I'm like, look, now we actually have a bigger platform. We have to win this case in the court of public opinion. And that's exactly what we did. Every chance we got to talk to the media, to shape our narrative, to speak the truth, to push back against political prosecution, that's what we did. We had an 11th woman who wrote a letter to the prosecutor saying drop the charges, and they charged her too. So there were 11 of us who wound up being charged. And this saga lasted from January of 2015 until November of 2015. But I constantly said in the media as a woman of faith, we will be vindicated. And at one point I was a blogger for the Star Tribune, which was our mainstream paper, and I remember writing letter from a Bloomington jail. And it was playing upon Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, because Bloomington was a city in which the Mall of America was located. And I talked about how everything that happened at the mall that day was an illustration of what Dr. King called the triple giants of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism. We saw all those things at play. The differences between the haves and the have-nots, and the differences between how people are treated on the basis of skin color. Thankfully, after a nearly year-long battle of fighting those charges, our charges were dismissed against all 11 of us in November of 2015. Now think about the fact that we're jubilant that the charges were dropped. I'm sure that the dean of my law school was happy. But then a week later, Jamar Clark was killed at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. I got the call at 4 o'clock in the morning from the Assistant Chief of Police. Part of why I got the call was the fact that in May of 2015, I had been elected president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And so I got the call, and I'm thinking this has to be bad for them to call me this time of morning. And I said, was he armed? No. And I said, this has to be bad. What they didn't tell me was that not only was he unarmed, not only was he a 24-year-old African-American man, but that he was shot in the head in front of over 30 witnesses. And the police had already started spinning their narrative in the media. They held a press conference in the wee hours of the morning to put their side of the story out there, and they didn't tell the people that he had been shot in the head. I couldn't go back to sleep. By 8 o'clock that morning, I looked on Facebook and I saw witness accounts of what happened. And the witnesses said that when the officers arrived on the scene, that they quickly threw Jamar's corpse, got his body, breathing, talking, his corpse into the back of an ambulance and drove off. They had the ambulance drive off. And they said that dozens of police arrived on the scene and they treated the witnesses like criminals. They pulled guns on them. They pepper sprayed them and they physically pushed them out of the way. And the people were traumatized as a result of what they said was witnessing an execution and having no one care. Now the crazy part about all of this is that I saw something like this coming. I, along with another professor, had warned city council. I had gone to the FBI, the US attorney, anyone who would listen, and I said, listen, we are poised to become the next Ferguson. For two reasons. Number one, our police forces are out of control. They have a long history of excessive force against the African American community in Minneapolis. Beyond that, there's a lot of economic injustice, and people are suffering under the weight of oppression, which leads to the types of uprisings that we've seen in other parts of the country. So we need to rein in the police force, and we need to create jobs immediately. They didn't listen. They said those statements were irresponsible. However, it was a forewarning of what was to come. The only reason the city of Minneapolis did not burn to the ground was because of the occupation that we wound up creating there. We got there, we started interviewing witnesses, we held a press conference so they could tell their side of the story, and then we refused to leave. We were out there until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. We blocked the service entrance of the police department so that cop cars couldn't go in and they couldn't go out. The assistant chief came to me and said, Nikema, please tell the community to move out of the way. We can't get to 911 calls. I said, absolutely not. I'm not telling the community to leave. Someone is dead because this police force is out of control and you guys did nothing about it. And the fact that you all are running off to these 911 calls means that people are winding up being beaten, unjustly arrested, or in Jamar Clark's case, killed. So we're not moving. Beyond that, public safety is the biggest expenditure in the budget. So go to another precinct in the area, because we're not leaving. And so that's what wound up happening that first night. And then young people wound up occupying the vestibule of the police precinct. And they said that they weren't leaving. Well, the next night, we wound up marching through Black Lives Matter, we went to the freeway and we shut it down. And as we shut down that particular freeway, an hour in, they said the state troopers are on the way. And you have a choice of either being arrested or getting off the freeway. 2/3 of the people exited off of the freeway. At that time, it was in my spirit, take the arrest. And I said to the young people, I'm gonna be arrested with you. And I remember standing there, we're chanting, we're singing, there's flashing lights all around, traffic is blocked for miles and miles. And we're standing off with the state troopers in front of us. And we know that we're about to be arrested, but we're still advocating. I'm yelling at the police, this looks like a scene from Selma. Why is it 2015 and all the state troopers are white? Something's wrong with that. Why are you taking us to jail when someone has been killed and those officers are still walking around free? How is that acceptable? And so over 40 of us were arrested that day, several of whom were actually juveniles. Now, one of the things that was interesting about that experience is that I was not afraid the entire time. In fact, I stepped forward at one point, I raised my hands in the air, just willing to be arrested first, and to try to show people that I wasn't afraid so that they wouldn't be afraid. But the first time that I was afraid throughout that whole ordeal was when I went into the sheriff's office. I had my hair braided just like this, except I had a ponytail holder. And they had searched me very thoroughly, which I'm like, this is inappropriate. You know we're not armed, this is a nonviolent demonstration. I felt my body being violated through that process. And they asked me, to take off my hair tie. And I said, show me the hair tie policy. Thinking like a lawyer. Why did I do that? The next thing you know, several officers began to surround me. And they start ushering me to the other side. Now I'm thinking they're going to show me the hair tie policy. I'm like, okay, it must be on the wall back here. And then I see them putting white gloves on.
Oh.
That was the first time I was afraid, because I realized these were all male deputies. There was a female deputy standing next to me who had searched me and who had summoned them over. They were willing to manhandle me and throw me in a single cell by myself. Everyone else who had been arrested had been in mass cells. And I said, wait a minute, what's going on? Well, ma'am, you're uncooperative, so we're gonna put you in this cell. And I'm like, what? How am I uncooperative? All I did was ask questions. I asked about the hair tie policy. Why are you gonna throw me into a cell? And as I'm talking, more and more deputies surround me with gloves on. And at that point, I demanded to speak to a supervisor or the sheriff who knows me. I'm like, this is unacceptable. And literally, I had to talk my way out of that situation. I don't know what would have happened to me if I continued to simply ask questions. And it helped me understand how someone like Sandra Bland could be killed. It helped me understand very clearly how someone like Natasha McKenna could be killed. And so many other women of color whose bodies are disregarded in this society just as they were during the days of slavery. So going through that experience gave me a new appreciation for the heroes and heroines who have fought for our freedom, who have fought for justice, who have fought for equality. And because of their blood, their sweat, their sacrifices, and their tears, we now have an opportunity to carry forward the work that they began. We have an opportunity to prevent souls from being killed in this society. We have an opportunity to be the torchbearers who say enough is enough. That we're not just going to focus on our own livelihoods and getting access to our own education and getting access to our own resources, but we're going to fight for those who are disenfranchised. We're going to fight for those who are marginalized. We're going to fight for those who are on the fringes of society crying out for justice. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, will we stand on the right side of history in this critical moment?
That's right.
Thank you all for being attentive to this process.
amazing? Are you just full and inspired and transformed? Another round of applause. If you'll just stand one more moment. Angie? Yes. Where? Okay. I know you guys have to go in like 2 minutes, so I want to do one quick thing, and then for those of you that can remain behind for a little bit of Q&A and maybe some additional discussion, please do so. But before, you speak the words.
This is,
Go, you go.
okay, sorry, we've done this so many times. So part of the Sojourner Truth lecture is also to honor the lecturer as the Sojourner Truth Award. So we are very pleased to honor you with this beautiful sculpture as
For all the work that you
for all
did.
the work that you have done. Please don't forget to fill out your assessments. There's a box on the way out the door. There are t-shirts on the back table. If you haven't already smelled, I'm smelling chicken wings and spinach wraps and all kinds of things that are in the back. But we can take some Q&A before that.
Okay, so if you need to leave, go ahead. If you'd like to remain for a few more minutes for questions, then please do so. Anybody have a burning question as those that need to leave?
So my name is Oscar Barton. I'm the chair of the campus there here at George Mason University. And I invited my dynamics class to come listen to you talk, so I'm pretty sure they enjoyed even more than hear me lecture today. So you talked about the context of drug policy and how it minimized, marginalized the communities. What are your thoughts on the impact of legalizing marijuana and its impact on marginalized communities?
That's a great question. So the question is basically, what do I think about the push to legalize marijuana and its impact on communities of color? I actually just wrote an article about this a couple of years ago called Going Up in Smoke, the impacts of drug war policy on young African American men. And I talked about the fact that in 2 states at the time, Colorado and I believe Washington, they had legalized marijuana. Initially, as a person of faith, I had been opposed to legalization. But as I started researching the issue and realizing how many resources are devoted towards trying to stop the flow of marijuana, how many people are incarcerated, the fact that the flow of drugs continues throughout the country, even though trillions have been spent on the war on drugs, I changed my perspective. Part of the problem, though, with the way that legalization is happening now is the fact that you have wealthy white businessmen doing exactly the same thing that poor Black and Latino men have been doing to feed their families, except they're not being demonized. They're paying taxes to the federal government, who is now profiting in a different way. They profited through the prison industry before, and now they're profiting off of the taxes that are being made from being able to legally sell marijuana. Those same Black and brown men who were demonized, many of them are still serving time in prison, which I find to be hypocritical. I also find it to be problematic that the threshold is so high, the insurance, the fees, that poor communities of color cannot afford to participate in that industry. But overall, if you look at the negative effects of alcohol and tobacco, they far exceed the negative effects of marijuana usage. It's all about how the dangers are articulated in this society, but we have more people who die from things like automobile crashes, for driving under the influence, or people who die from different types of cancer as a result of smoking. And both of those things are sanctioned by and regulated by the federal government. So I think there's a lot of propaganda involved with the supposed harmful effects of marijuana, and I would like to see changes to our state and federal laws as a result. But they need to let people out of prison who've been incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses.
Yeah, I just want to get your opinion really quick on the minimum wage. I know there's a lot of people who think that the minimum wage actually has
Can you speak up a little bit?
I just want to get your opinion on the minimum wage. I know there's a lot of people who believe that the minimum wage has been detrimental to black people in America. I just want to get your opinion on what you think about it.
So the question was about the minimum wage and what I think about it. So there's a big push for 15 now. It happened in Seattle already. We're fighting for 15 now in the city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota. I think it's absolutely necessary to raise the minimum wage. It is ridiculous that so many people work and still can't put food on their table. They still can't afford a place to live. And they still have to rely upon government benefits while working full time, which to me makes absolutely no sense. I also think that the focus on 15 now is actually a continuation of the fight that began before Dr. King was assassinated. Very few people know that in November of 1967, Dr. King said that they were going to launch a Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. He said, we're going to go to Washington, D.C. in April of 1968. We're going to demand a higher minimum wage. We're going to demand a guaranteed minimum income for all Americans. We're going to demand universal health care and affordable housing. Well, I would argue that that's when Dr. King really became a threat in American society, because he threatened to upend the system of capitalism, essentially. And the Poor People's Campaign went forward, but not with the full force and power that it would have had Dr. King not been assassinated in April of 1968. I do not believe that that was a coincidence. We have not seen wages rise for working class people really since that time, but we have seen a rise in CEO salaries since that time and the wealth of the 1%, which clearly I find to be problematic.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for coming, and I love your edges, by the way. I'm a Christian, and I just wanted to know, in the midst of all the injustice that you witness, day by day, how big of a role does your faith play in that? And also, do you face kind of a non-supportive backing from the black community as you help them as well?
Mm-hmm. So, great question. So I would say my faith is the main reason why I do what I do. I cannot imagine doing this work without God being in the center of it, because he gives me strength when I want to give up. He gives me ingenuity in terms of how to think about things and how to do things differently or to defy expectations. And just the strength and courage to persevere in the midst of adversity. I mean, I pray a lot. And actually during that 4th Precinct occupation, which lasted for 18 days, through blizzards, through, police and riot gear and everything, and through 4 white supremacists showing up and shooting 5 black men, we prayed. When things would happen, we would gather people and just begin to pray. And it warded off a lot of evil that was within the atmosphere that was fighting against our movement. And when people would see ministers walking around, people who had never been to church or did not believe in God would ask those ministers to pray for them. I think about people like Harriet Tubman, who was led by the Spirit of God to become the conductor of the Underground Railroad and to help free slaves. And she talked about how her faith played a huge role in her having the strength and the courage to help set people free from captivity. And a lot of times people think that if you're a person of faith, that you're supposed to be meek and mild and cower in a corner somewhere. I think the exact opposite is true. In fact, Harriet Tubman carried a revolver around. And there was a story where one of the people who was trying to escape from slavery got scared and wanted to go back to the plantation. And she pointed a gun to his head and was like, either you coming with us or you gonna go a different way. Obviously, he escaped and became free. And again, she was a woman who was led by faith. So I find a lot of strength in that. I find courage in that. Rosa Parks was guided by faith when she refused to give up her seat. And obviously, Dr. King spoke a lot about his faith and the influence of God in his life. In terms of opposition, I would say that there are at times generational divides, just like in any community, but we see it very pervasively within the African American community. I work a lot with young people because they're still idealistic in many ways, and they haven't fully bought into the way that things are, from my experience. And so sometimes I run up against old guard leadership who support the status quo. And sometimes they have not only bought into the system, but they sold out for political favors or a seat at the proverbial tables of power. That actually happened during the occupation, where several of us from the community, so mostly poor African American folks, would not leave the occupation when the mayor and other government leaders wanted us to. And so the mayor had several African American leaders stand with her at a press conference and demand that we leave the occupation. And a lot of these were, you know, visible leaders, established leaders in the community who held some form of power. One of whom included Congressman Keith Ellison, who was our first African American congressperson, first Muslim in the country. And we were friends before the occupation. Let's just say we stood on opposite sides. And when we saw the mayor line up black leadership and we felt exploit the divide, the generational divide in the community, we fought back. We lined up with the people, we held our own press conference and we said, we're not going anywhere. That we want to see justice for Jamar Clark. We want to see the tapes released. We want to see those officers held accountable. The weather is not deterring us. Freezing cold temperatures, a blizzard. We're like, no. And then I called them the Black Miss Leadership class. You know, I mean, I didn't mince words because I wanted people to understand that just because you're African American doesn't mean you have the interests of the African American community in mind. And it especially doesn't mean that you have the interests of poor black people in mind. Sometimes you have people who are African American, unfortunately, who have built their careers and their livelihoods off of the backs of other poor black people. And historically, we had some black people who owned slaves. So when you know that history, you're not just blinded by race and kind of going along to get along. I stand up against that type of injustice as well.
See, 1, 2, 3 more questions, and
So
then we
who-
will disperse.
Who else? Who was the third person?
Gentleman on the second row.
Okay,
So
okay.
2 in the front and gentleman in the second row.
So I think what most people don't realize is that a lot of activists, they have full-time jobs and they're doing this on, you know, and their nights off, their weekends. So with knowing how busy you are and everything that's happening, like what does self-care look like for you in the movement?
Self-care is definitely a challenge. After the 18-day occupation, I mean, we were barely sleeping, eating when we could. My mother made me come home to California to spend time over the Christmas holiday, and I went reluctantly, but the reality is that I needed to rest. And so I spent time just unwinding and having fun, which I had to force myself to do because it was a very traumatic experience. It took weeks to recover from the occupation. In fact, at least one of the members of Black Lives Matter wound up being hospitalized in the aftermath of that experience. So it definitely reminded me that sometimes I have to slow down and I have to take time and I have to rest. I also have wonderful friends around me where we work hard, but we also play hard. So we might be in a protest during the day, at night we might be at a restaurant or watching a movie or listening to music, at a local establishment. And we keep each other grounded. You know, when we see each other being tired, we try to fill in for each other or remind ourselves that we need to rest. And so it's something you have to work at on an ongoing basis. I definitely don't have the balance that I should have, but I'm a lot better than I used to be in terms of taking time. So some Mondays when I don't teach, I may be at home asleep, or seriously, or working from home or going shopping, retail therapy. So, and I don't apologize for it. So that's kind of how I do it. But again, I have to be reminded at times because I'm just very tenacious in terms of what I do, and I'm very fueled by this passion for justice, but I don't want to burn out at the same time.
Thank you. To say thank you would be nowhere near enough, but thank you. I'm Rose Chervin, I'm faculty in philosophy, African American studies, and women and gender studies, and I was very much transformed by the way you connected several things. I wanted to ask some questions about where you see certain things going. You connected the 13th Amendment and the property over people, both of which come very clearly from the thought of John Locke. And I think we can connect the third thing. I think, if I'm not mistaken, when Michael Brown was killed, Darren Wilson said, "Oh, I was so scared of him, I was afraid of him, and that's why I killed him." And then if you look to the police officers in Oregon when that group of people took over that wildlife sanctuary, and they were asked, "Well, why didn't you shoot them?" "Well, because we were scared." "Oh, so you're scared so you don't shoot a white person, but you're scared so you do shoot a black person?"
Right.
That's like accepted. It's like logic. But it comes out of the idea of what's a person. And in a way that comes out of Locke. So I'm sort of seeing several different threads. I'm wondering how to pursue them. One is, do you see a way of working to change the 13th Amendment, which allows, as you said, slavery? And the second would be, in terms of, I see soul killing amongst my students when, if in fact we have black students of color generally, who are seen as, okay, they are something to be afraid of. You are not a community, okay? And you grew up like that. Okay, now how do we, as we go on as educators, sort of get therapy for this soul killing? And, is there some way we should change the testing system? Change what let's say what courses people might take in college, how things are presented so that they can go on and so that they can be people that someone would not see as, oh, well, let's just go and prison them. Right. You see, I don't know if I'm making any sense here. I'm just so passionate about what you say. But I'm just wondering about the threads that you see going forward in these different directions.
Well, I see the circumstances in which someone can kill an unarmed black person and say they were afraid as being a perpetuation of this narrative that has run throughout our history since the days of slavery, as the black man as criminal and something to be feared.
Yeah.
And part of that has to do with who is writing the narrative. So when you look back, for example, at the brutal system of slavery, rarely did we have white people largely being demonized as, people who were brutalizers, people who were inhumane in how they treated other people. The people who were victimized were the ones who were painted that way. During the lynching era, same thing. You would see white families standing around, including white children, a burning black body, laughing, pointing, eating food. They would trade postcards of black bodies that were lynched. And when I see those photos, I'm thinking, where is child protection? These are unfit parents. But again, who's controlling the narrative? Who's controlling the system? The person who is killed is seen as the perpetrator and as though that person deserved it. And so the same narratives are running forward when we see an unarmed person be killed by police. They're digging up people's criminal history. They're trying to find any little thing to justify that person being killed. And then they're telling us to continue to trust in the system. So the way that I personally combat that is, number one, knowing my history. I have felt a sense of empowerment ever since I studied the institution of slavery, ever since I started studying Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. Because on the one hand, I saw a history of my ancestors facing oppression, but on the other hand, I saw a spirit of resilience and ingenuity in the face of oppression and resistance to that oppression. And that's the spirit that I chose to tap into in my work, where I decided that although society tries to paint us as being inferior because of the color of our skin, that I am not going to yield to society's perception of who I am. That when I walk into a room, I am walking in with the boldness and the brilliance of those who fought against oppression and knowing that our ancestors are pushing us forward. And so it's important for us to know our history and to internalize those aspects that give us strength. Because if they could come out of slavery and still have hope, there's no excuse for the rest of us. I also think that it's important for our white brothers and sisters and allies to know their own history. Because so often I believe that white people have to put their own humanity on a shelf. Number one, to tolerate a racist and oppressive system and to live in it and to be blind to it. But number two, you're essentially given a bargaining chip. Exchange any sense of ethnic identity or heritage for the privileges that come with simply being white. There is no real culture to whiteness. Languages, heritage, identity, something's wrong with that picture. And yet, most of our white friends and allies accept that reality for the sake of blending in and getting ahead. I think that's just as dangerous as what we encounter as African Americans when we internalize a sense of inferiority. And so if our white brothers and sisters began to grapple with identity in a different way, it would cause them to not only question the way that the system is structured, they would question the privileges that they have inherited and either reject those privileges or use them to fight against racial injustice. And so I challenge, my white friends, I say, you have all this privilege, how are you going to use it? Sometimes our legislators will only listen to white people. Are you calling when you see an injustice happening and hold your legislators accountable for that? When you see false or biased media narratives coming forward, are you calling into those TV stations or radio shows and challenging that narrative, or are you just accepting it? So those are things that I think we have to do to begin to fight back against oppression, really just speaking truth to power, critical thinking, and making a decision that we're not going to accept the status quo. Yes.
So thank you so much for giving your speech. It was really eye-opening for a lot of different reasons. I was wondering what you thought about so we mainly, when we talk about racism, we mainly focus on the United States, which is obviously one of the most violent places in terms of that. But how do you suppose we could tackle racism in countries where it is brought up less often, where societies are kind of a bit more homogenous, like in Japan or Korea, where they haven't really gone through the same sort of justice as the United States?
So my hands are full in the United States. It's a great question, but right now I can't imagine it. For me personally, because of all of the fighting that I do here and that's still left to do. But I think that if there are people who are passionate about what's happening in other countries, to think about who their allies are within those countries who agree with their perspective. I mean, that's really how you organize. You find like-minded people as you start espousing different ideas who are willing to stand with you and who agree with you, and then who are willing to take some type of action. And it is a process. That's how the slave trade ended in England. There were folks who got together, they became known as the Clapham Circle. Some of them were in Parliament. Others were everyday, ordinary citizens who band together and they said, we are going to end this vicious slave trade happening in our country. And they began to put forward narratives, humanizing people of African ancestry, books, medallions, having campaigns. I think it's the same organizing principle wherever you go. It's just a matter of finding those individuals who see a problem with the way that things are in that given society or country and who are willing to do something about it. And I have been to other countries where we've had that conversation, like in South Africa, for example, where you see Black people in the majority, but they're still overwhelmingly poor. They still overwhelmingly lack political power. And people think because there was a Black president in the form of Nelson Mandela that things have changed drastically, and they haven't. Just like in America, we have a Black president, but in many ways we're still back at square one as far as race relations are concerned. But I think those organizing principles are the same all around the world. Just a matter of having people who are passionate and committed and willing to fight for what they believe in until they see change happen.
So wonderfully generous with your time. I think you walked in the door at 11:45 and you've been with us. and you've been so passionate and committed to engaging with Mason students, faculty, and staff. So thank you again. Another round of applause. And thank all of you for your attention and questions. And I think we're going to hang around a little bit longer, so feel free to chat and to continue this dialogue. See you next year, 2017.